It's time for Talk Law Radio with Todd Marquardt. Todd Marquardt, attorney at law in Texas. If you're a millionaire or a thousandaire, Talk Law Radio is now on the air. Call in with your business law question, your elder law question, veteran aid, Medicaid, build a business to get paid. 210-308-8867. Or ask a question online at marquardtlawfirm.com. That's MARQUARDT lawfirm.com. And now it's Talk Law Radio with Todd Marquardt.
Welcome to Talk Law Radio. I'm Todd Marquardt, on the radio, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on talklawradio.com. Today we're going to be talking with Pete Sepp, who is the president of the nonprofit and nonpartisan National Taxpayers Union. And we're going to be focusing on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Pete, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Tell us what's happening today that we need to know about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Well, it's almost what's happening every minute. There's always a new development with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I call it B3 for short. What this is, of course, is the centerpiece legislation from President Trump and Republican leaders in Congress to do several things. One, to extend and improve upon the tax relief laws that were enacted in 2017. Another, to make very strategic restraints and certain reductions in federal programs. Spending will still go up, just not as quickly. And wherever possible, to enact certain regulatory reforms that have a fiscal impact. So B3 does all of those things under a process called reconciliation.
Tell us what your organization does and why are you so knowledgeable about this?
Well, my organization, National Taxpayers Union, was founded all the way back in 1969 by a graduate student, the name of James Dale Davidson. He had just finished working for Richard Nixon's presidential campaign, and he realized at the time neither political party necessarily had the interests of taxpayers at heart 100% of the time. He had hoped to join a taxpayer group in Washington, D.C. that was nonpartisan, conservative fiscally, but still nonpartisan. He couldn't find one in the phone book, so he decided to start his own. And that's how National Taxpayers Union was born. Our mission is to work for lower, fairer, simpler taxes, less wasteful government spending at all levels, and accountability from public officials. And by all levels, I mean not only from the cities and the counties and the states and the federal government, but all the way up to the international sphere.
Can you tell us what's the difference between a 501c3 charity, public charity, and the way that you're organized?
National Taxpayers Union is organized as a 501c4 public and social welfare organization, and what that allows us to do is to lobby Congress. And the 501c3 organization, our National Taxpayers Union Foundation, is devoted solely to research and public education. It does not lobby Congress and advocate for legislation.
Okay, so you have two organizations that are both focused on helping taxpayers do what you said before, lower taxes, simpler taxes.
Yes, and less wasteful government spending. Our C3 arm, National Taxpayers Union Foundation, also has a public interest litigation function, meaning that we'll take state and local governments as well as the IRS to court when we feel there is an important precedent to set on behalf of taxpayer rights or to challenge an unfair or retroactive activity.
I love that.
We've been involved in a lot of cases. We file friend of the court briefs. We've also represented clients. One of our most recent victories was in Colorado, defending a constitutional limit on taxes and spending that requires voter approval for taxes to go up. There was a water district in Colorado that didn't see it that way, and they raised taxes without a public vote, we won. And now this water district's going to have to pay damages to the taxpayers they never asked in taking money out of their wallets.
I'm sure that makes all your constituents happy. I wanted to remind everybody the reason that I'm having Pete Sepp from the National Taxpayers Union on the show today is because it's our mission to help you discover your legal issue blind spots by listening to me talk about the law on the radio. And this is an issue that's very confusing to people because of the way Congress works. And so I want you to help us understand that as we go along. And I want to start with the word reconciliation. What makes reconciliation different than other types of budget and spending bills?
Well, reconciliation, as the term might imply to most folks, is a way that the House and the Senate resolve their differences, reconcile them in a budget process. Reconciliation differs from other types of fiscal policy, like a tax bill, say, that's increasing or decreasing one rate of tax on one type of tax. It differs from appropriations. That's the annual process where a large part of the federal government gets funded. Transportation, defense, if the federal government remains involved in education, that's where the appropriations process would come in. Reconciliation is a different process that sets overall tax and spending targets for usually a 10-year or 9-year period of time. The House passes its version, the Senate passes its version, they confer or they swap amendments in the nature of substitutes, all kinds of technical terms, but they arrive at a blueprint for taxes and spending over the long term that contain a variety of specific policies. And what that does is set the tone for appropriations and tax policy year by year that Congress will later work on. The key to reconciliation is that unlike most legislation that goes through the Senate, where you require at least 60 votes out of 100 to proceed with debate on the bill, reconciliation can go forward with just 51 votes, a majority of votes. And that's why it's such a powerful tool when one party finds itself with relatively narrow control of the legislative chambers. If you don't have at least 60 votes in the Senate as the majority party, most of your bills are going nowhere. The minority party can block them. And so with Republicans having just 53 seats in the Senate, they've got to use reconciliation to get some of their biggest fiscal priorities through.
So this question may be coming out of left field, but I'm just wondering, why doesn't Congress use reconciliation every year? Now, I'm a young man, and I've only been following the government and politics for 45 years, so I haven't heard this term reconciliation every year. Like, I do recognize the word appropriation and having a budget. I don't think the federal government's had one of those in a long time. But
No.
why don't we see this every year?
Well, we see it frequently, often every 2 years, every 3 years. A lot depends upon the fiscal priorities of the party that's in power in Congress, as well as who's president, of course. It can be used at least once a year, but it isn't always, primarily for, well, I'd give it two reasons. One, I hate to be cynical, but Congress really can't walk and chew gum at the same time. It's very difficult for them to get together such a large piece of legislation reflecting broad priorities in taxes and spending each year. They tend to do it every 2 years or 3 just because of the workload. Another reason is that many members of Congress may prefer to just let that current policy ride. If, for example, you want to extend the 2017 Trump tax cuts, which we can get into, for a period of 8 or 9 years, and you do that in the reconciliation process this year, you don't need to worry about it for another 8 or 9 years. So why even bother?
Yeah, I do. I do want to talk about the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and what happens if it expires and what's important for getting it through on this bill. But we'll head that up in just a moment. I had a question about the reconciliation process again. Now, we do know that the House passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and that was a huge feat for 51% of the congressmen to agree on. What changes do you think that the Senate is going to make, and do you think that when it goes back to the House that the House members will agree with what the Senate changed?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and we are getting constant feedback and intelligence from Capitol Hill to our own lobbying team here at National Taxpayers Union, and the conditions keep shifting. As of now, we think that the Senate will probably focus on 3 or 4 areas. One area is the energy tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act. That was passed through a reconciliation process all the way back during the Biden administration. Okay. And a number of those energy credits were placed into law that have a huge revenue impact. In fact, a much larger one than originally anticipated. These are credits for developing wind and solar, nuclear energy, for other very advanced renewable technologies, biomass and geothermal. There were also some residential energy efficiency credits that were passed in that bill. Well, the One Big Beautiful Bill passed by the House sought to phase those out because the revenue impact was much larger than originally anticipated. Plus, there's the question of whether these kinds of very narrowly drafted credits designed to influence a specific human behavior, essentially, really belong in the tax code. Maybe there should be something simpler that's neutral and fair to all businesses. And so the House version of One Big Beautiful Bill sunsetted most of those credits on a pretty fast timetable. Most of them expire in either 2026. Those are a lot of the consumer energy efficiency credits. Most others that are business-oriented for building projects, that's all gone in roughly 2028, a little longer but clear. And so before in the Senate, yes.
Before you get to the other 3 points, we've got to take a break. Stay tuned. We're going to talk more.
Planning for your summer vacation? Don't forget to plan for the things that really matter. None of us are guaranteed tomorrow. Have you planned for your final affairs? Why spend time and money on vacation plans but neglect your legacy? Contact Marquardt Law Firm today. Our attorneys focus on business and estate law, including last wills, living trusts, and tax-protected inheritance plans. Call 210-530-4278. That's 210-530-4278. Or visit marquardtlawfirm.com.
Today, Pete Sepp is here from the National Taxpayers Union, helping us to understand the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the reconciliation process, and in the last segment, he was telling us about his prediction about what the Senate is focused on and the changes that the Senate might make to the House version of the bill. We got through one of those possible changes. Let's get started on the other 3.
So another change we might see the Senate make to the One Big Beautiful Bill has to do with business tax deductions. Now, in the current version, there is what's called full and immediate expensing. This means that if a business buys $10,000 worth of equipment, it can write off that $10,000 of cost in the year that the purchase is made against their tax liability. The problem with the old law was that you had to do something called depreciation. You could only write off part of that amount, upwards of about $1,250 a year. And on the rest of that money that you spent, you were taxed on it as if it were a profit. I mean, that's a ridiculous way of trying to respect business activity in this country. And so right now, the House's version of the One Big Beautiful Bill has that good full and immediate expensing, but only for 5 years. The Senate may try to make that provision 10 years or more to kind of add to the certainty businesses need to move forward with investment. It's no secret that when this tax break started to phase out in 2022, investment decreased in the business world. So we need to pay attention to that. And I hope the Senate acts.
That makes sense. I'm glad that you brought some of the business benefits into our discussion today, because Marquardt Law Firm sponsors the show, and attorneys at Marquardt Law Firm focus on business law and helping business owners structure their business and analyze corporations and contracts and the like. So thank you for mentioning that. Let's continue on some of the predictable changes that the Senate might want to make.
Well, now we come to a potentially bad change, and that has to do with the Medicaid provisions. The House bill enacts some reforms to help reduce waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicaid, to keep states from unfairly running up Medicaid benefits to the point where the federal government has to match them at great expense. And it would tighten some of the eligibility rules around work requirements to receive Medicaid. Well, opponents of that predictably are saying, oh, this is going to be a terrible thing. People will be deprived of their health care. What's really going on here is saving the Medicaid system, which is running at such a terrible deficit, along with Medicare, frankly, the hospital insurance part. We've got to make sure that these programs are there for those who need it most. And the House bill slows the growth of Medicaid from about 4.5% of spending increase a year to 3%. That is hardly a huge sacrifice, but there are some members of the Senate in the Republican caucus who are saying that's too much. We can't do it. We want to rip those provisions out. Well, that's going to increase the deficit and worsen Medicaid's problems. We don't want to see the Senate make that change.
Okay. Well, now that you mentioned something that the House is probably not going to like, it made me think of your supporters of the National Taxpayers Union. Tell us a little bit of the makeup of the types of people that support your organization, and how do they support it?
Sure. We welcome support from anyone who is concerned about the fiscal trajectory of any level of government, taxes, spending, debt, regulation. We work on those issues, and we want all taxpayers to feel comfortable joining us in our mission. Our primary constituents are individual taxpayers in the upper middle class. Small business owners are disproportionately represented in our membership. A lot of that is because they're at the tip of the spear when it comes to IRS law enforcement. They don't necessarily have the resources that big businesses do to fight back when they're unfairly audited, and yet they have a little more income that the IRS could get its hands on than your typical working class family. And so we're especially sensitive to their concerns.
I think that there might be more people in San Antonio interested in what you have to say. So I'm glad that you're on the show today. Again, this is Pete Sepp. He's the president of National Taxpayers Union. We've been talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and he was telling us about some of the changes that the Senate might make to the House bill that's already been passed. And I think you had one more point, number 4.
Well, my fourth point would be whether the Senate is going to simplify and modify some of President Trump's tax priorities. We may recall that on the campaign trail, he said he wanted to get rid of the tax on tipped income, get rid of taxes on overtime, do something about taxes on the interest from auto loans, and do something about taxes on Social Security. Well, the One Big Beautiful Bill kind of takes a decent approach towards Social Security. They're simply increasing the standard deduction that you take before you declare your taxable income for seniors. Mm-hmm. So that's a relatively simple way of doing it. But the others are quite complicated. They only last for a few years. The rules haven't been written on how you get these tax breaks. The Senate may decide, well, look, it's not fair to just confine this tax relief to people who happen to work overtime in a formal sense or get tips. Why not just allow all working people to get some form of tax relief, maybe increasing their standard deduction further or increasing the child tax credit further? Those would be easier ways of doing a similar thing.
Is there a signal from Ted Cruz, who introduced the no tax on tips? Is that a signal that they want something different?
It might be, and that's highly dependent on how long the Senate decides to mark up, that's what they call it, the House's version of the One Big Beautiful Bill. There have already been committee hearings on parts of the One Big Beautiful Bill in the Senate. The armed services portion, for example, was just marked up. Didn't vary much at all with what the House passed. I suspect, though, when we get to the energy title, when we get to the tax title portion of the bill, we will see more changes. What matters is this looming self-imposed deadline in the Senate. They want to have their version done and passed by July 4th. Well, that's less than a month away.
Right.
And like I said, Congress doesn't walk and chew gum at the same time. It's going to be a slow process. So they're going to have to watch their time and be careful about how many modifications they make.
Okay. Well, before we get on to the next point, I wanted to give you 3 minutes to talk about the National Taxpayers Union. What do you usually tell people are the most important parts of your organization?
The most important parts are we engage in shoe leather lobbying. In other words, lots of special interests have a lobbyist on Capitol Hill. Well, taxpayers need a lobbyist on Capitol Hill. That's the kind of thing we do. Anybody can send letters to Congress, can protest outside of Congress, can get on TV and complain about government, but there are very few organizations that actually have a dedicated lobbying team to try and advocate on legislation that matters to taxpayers. That's one of the things we do. I mentioned earlier that our research arm, NTU Foundation, does public interest litigation. Not many organizations do that on the tax issue. You can find some on the so-called center right that work on school choice or regulatory reform. We do our litigation on taxes and things that set precedents there. Another thing we do is research on very complex issues like IRS regulations or the way that the Congressional Budget Office assigns scores to legislation. Very minute stuff, but somebody's got to look into this and be the taxpayer advocate, the one in the room to say to the Congressional Budget Office and the IRS, here are the priorities you should be focusing on first. and we do that work as well. So when I became president 10 years ago, we had the decision of how do we compete with other organizations in our space? And my answer was we don't compete. We do what others are not doing in our movement, and we fulfill those needs.
Okay. In our next segment, I'd like to talk about the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and how this one big, beautiful bill might save it. But before we do that, we've got to take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome to Talk Law Radio. I'm here with Pete Sepp with the National Taxpayers Union. We've been talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and what reconciliation means, what changes the Senate is likely to make before it sends the bill back to the House of Representatives. And we've been talking a lot about the National Taxpayers Union as an organization and all of the things that they do. And in this segment, Mr. Sepp, I want to talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which is set to expire or sunset at the end of 2025. How can we get that extended?
Well, there is a lot to extend, and the 2017 law has been vital in the economic growth factor that has made our economy successful until very recently, I'm afraid. But the 2017 taxpayer relief law that President Trump signed made sweeping changes both to the individual and business portions of the tax code. For example, individual tax rates went way down. Originally, they were 10% all the way up to 39.6%. They went from 10% to 37%. The median rate went 3 percentage points down. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're looking at $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 of taxable income, yeah, those 3 percentage points make a big difference. The standard deduction.
I think most people would appreciate getting a 3% pay raise.
Yes. And I mean, the list goes on here because the child tax credit, for example, that was only $1,000 per qualifying child, doubled under that law to $2,000. And we have to bear in mind that's a credit, not a deduction. In other words, a direct amount of tax that you no longer have to pay. $1,000 less tax for every qualifying child. That's huge. If you have a family of 3 qualifying kids, you suddenly had $3,000 more in your pocket every year because of this law, on top of the reduced tax rates, on top of things like a new credit for small business income. Now, this, I should say, this is a deduction, not a credit, but if you have a small business, if you're a consultant, if you have, a handful of employees, if you are self-employed, you could qualify for a 20% tax deduction. Now, if you had $50,000 of small business income, which is quite possible, what that means is you get to shield $10,000 of your income from taxes. And say you're in the 22% tax bracket. Well, that's $2,200 worth of tax savings. And so once you start doing the math here and you realize, okay, let's look at a 2-earner household. One has a wage-paying job, the other a small business inside the home, 3 qualifying kids. This 2017 law could easily save a household like that between $6,000 and $7,000 every year. That is a meaningful amount of tax savings.
And so you haven't been talking about millionaires and billionaires savings on tax dollars. You've been talking about regular working people. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And the biggest secret of this law is that it actually made the tax code more progressive. Progressive being that higher and higher rates fall upon folks with higher and higher incomes. You know, the left in this country is very fond of criticizing the 2017 law for supposedly giving away a lot of money to the rich. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, you know, it's your money to begin with. The government is taking it from you, not giving it to you.
Right.
But setting that aside, the fact is that since the passage of that law in 2017, the top 1% and top 10% of taxpayers are actually shouldering a little bigger share of the current revenue load than they were prior to 2017. So it has become more progressive.
And so what happens if this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act does expire? What's going to happen to those regular people?
Boy, it would be a nightmare scenario. You think, okay, the child tax credit gets cut in half right away. If you have 2 kids or 3 kids, that's a $2,000 or $3,000 tax hike right off the bat. Your individual tax rate goes back up. If you were, say, in the 25% median bracket, or the 22% median bracket, you'd be paying 25%. Your small business would no longer have that 20% deduction. The standard deduction would be cut virtually in half. The dreaded alternative minimum tax, a very sneaky tax law that all of your listeners should be aware of, that would come back in full force. Somewhere between 6 and 7 million households across the country would be affected by that. So all kinds of terrible implications at the worst possible time. Trillions of dollars in additional taxes over 10 years.
Do you think that it would have been a better idea just to focus on extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act rather than rolling it into something like the One Big Beautiful Bill that includes so many other things?
Yeah, ultimately, I think that's a good question because we see in some of these provisions that they're only temporary. In other words, they don't survive past 4, 5, 6 years. And so you have to think, well, wouldn't we want to make that full and immediate expensing a 10-year or permanent provision as opposed to just 5 years? Would we want the additional child tax credit? This bill provides an extra $500. Well, but it's only doing that for 4 years. So you have to imagine if we could kind of clear out some of the campaign trail promises and other tweaks and credits and bonuses and whatnot, and just say, look, we're going to take all of the revenue impact from those provisions and we're going to plow them into making the 2017 laws permanent across the board so taxpayers can always count on them, at least reasonably count on them. I think that might be a better way to go.
You mentioned the entitlement programs, Medicaid and Medicare, and one of the criticisms that I read in the news about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was that when the budget exceeds a certain amount, when the deficit exceeds a certain amount, it triggers something called sequestration under the Statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, in 2010, a statutory law was enacted. In fact, it was a fight over whether to raise the legal ceiling on the national debt, and an agreement was reached to have yearly caps on a part of the budget that's called discretionary spending. That's the part that funds those roads and defense and other items through annual appropriations that I mentioned earlier. It's not the whole federal budget. It doesn't include the entitlements that you just mentioned, but it's a decent part of the budget. And those caps were supposed to be hard and fast, limiting spending in Congress. They worked for about 4 or 5 years until lawmakers started suspending the caps for what they saw as an important emergency. We have a national security problem giving foreign aid out, and we need more money, so we'll exceed the cap just for this year. And it just snowballed to the point where the spending caps have been pretty badly weakened. Well, the one big beautiful bill is basically saying, look, we're going to have an enforcement mechanism here so that if the federal deficit gets out of control, as much as $1.5 trillion and perhaps even $2 trillion, depending on the procedure that's invoked, will be clawed back over the life of the bill. Now, again, that does not mean that spending will be cut by that amount. Rather, the rate of increase will be slowed. And that's why you see the federal deficits persisting despite the fact that there is all of this spending restraint in the bill. It's still not enough.
So the media makes it sound like that sequestration is going to cause cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, but I think you said that only happens to discretionary spending, not entitlement spending.
That's right. And there is a provision in the One Big Beautiful Bill for Medicaid reforms, not Medicare, Medicaid. And I mentioned that earlier as a reminder. What they're proposing here is not to actually cut Medicaid spending, but rather to slow its rate of growth. Instead of 4.5% a year of increase, it'll go 3% a year of increase. So I'm afraid, yes, this might mean adjustments in the program. Some things might not be as generous going forward in Medicaid benefits, but that doesn't mean that there will be cuts for millions of people to have to cope with.
Yeah, well, thank you for explaining that, because the media has been harping on that. We're nearing the end of this segment. In our next segment, I want to talk about your legacy, or what legacy means to you or to the National Taxpayers Union. And so I hope that that's okay. You can share as much or as little as you like. But for now, we've got to take a break. We'll be right back.
Planning for your summer vacation? Don't forget to plan for the things that really matter. None of us are guaranteed tomorrow. Have you planned for your final affairs? Why spend time and money on vacation plans but neglect your legacy? Contact Marquardt Law Firm today. Our attorneys focus on business and estate law, including last wills, living trusts, and tax-protected inheritance plans. Call 210-530-4278. That's 210-530-4278. Or visit marquardtlawfirm.com.
Welcome back to Talk Law Radio. I'm Todd Marquardt. On the radio, on podcasts everywhere, on Facebook Live, and on YouTube. Remember that the YouTube segments are cut into bite-sized parts so that you can listen to different topics while you're doing the dishes, while you're walking the dog, and while you're doing your homework if you want to. This is our fourth segment, and that's the legacy segment.
And now, it's time for the Talk Law Radio Legacy Spotlight. What's your legacy? Sponsored by Marquardt Law Firm.
So Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union, is here with me talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And you've been telling us a lot about the National Taxpayers Union and its mission throughout the show. I wondered about you personally. I haven't asked you a lot of personal questions, so I'd like to know, what do you think of legacy? How would you define it in your own life, and what do you hope to see? How do you hope people will remember you?
Well, I don't define legacy as a material thing. There could be any of a number of pieces of property from my dad's watch on down that I would consider a legacy, but that really pales in comparison to the two policy-based legacies that I've wanted to leave behind in my career. The first has to do with giving the American taxpayer rights and respect from their government. My second day on the job, I answered a phone call from a fellow, and again, this was 1988, who had reached the end of his rope. He found, unfortunately, the legal blind spot with problems with the IRS, and he told me he could no longer go on living because the government had handed him to that point.
Wow.
I don't know what happened to that fellow. I do know of others who have taken their own lives over IRS problems. I don't ever want that to happen to anyone. And there are laws, protections, and litigation that we can do to try and keep taxpayers from being abused by their own government. And that's an important thing to leave behind. We have successfully enacted 5 separate taxpayer rights laws. We're working on a 6th one because the job is never done. You always have to keep reforming the system so that people are protected. And I guess my second legacy has to do with debt. I mean, as the Bible says, the borrower is servant to the lender.
Right.
And I've seen that so many times in my career since 1988, both political parties saying, we'll get around to the debt problem next year. And next year never comes. Well, the day of reckoning is coming for us. I mean, you look at the bond auctions for federal government debt that occurred last week. There were very few takers in the investment community because there is an increasing lack of confidence in this government's finances. I'm not here to preach doomsday, but it is a cause for concern.
So
it's our irresponsible borrowing.
What are some of the things that you have done or that you plan to do to make that mark so that people remember you for doing that?
Well, when it comes to debt, we absolutely need some kind of permanent, lasting constitutional protection that says if the government wants to borrow, you need an extraordinary majority in Congress, 3/5, 2/3 to do it. And in good years, we should not be thinking about adding to the debt. In bad years, we should be very careful about doing it. And I'm convinced that in the end, that's what's going to be the solution, a constitutional approach, something like what the Swiss government has in what's called their debt brake. And we've come close to getting that passed in the 1990s, but it's been an uphill climb.
Do you have information or resources on the National Taxpayers Union website so that people can learn more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Our website is NTU, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org.
Okay, great. Well, that's all I want to say about legacy. I want to go back to something that's been in the news, criticism by Elon Musk about the One Big Beautiful Bill. Is he out of line there? Is there anything that you think he's right about?
Well, I'm not sure that his characterization of the bill as an abomination that should be killed is accurate. I certainly think that the taxpayer relief provisions preventing a $3.5, even $4 trillion tax increase from strangling the economy, that's an important plus in the One Big Beautiful Bill. We can't ignore that. I think that some of the slowdowns in federal spending and the reforms to Medicaid are a good start. I wouldn't dismiss his concerns entirely, though. The fact is that even if the One Beautiful Bill passes as is, the federal debt will rise by roughly $4 trillion over the next 2 years or so. And our debt is already at $36 trillion. Thinking that it would be past 40 under a Republican Congress and president gives us pause to think, well, if you're going to walk the walk on fiscal conservatism here, you're going to have to do a better job in controlling spending. You may not do it in the One Big Beautiful Bill. You may have to do it in things like that rescission package.
I was just going to ask that. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's probably another term that people who don't follow politics know about, and they're hearing about it in the media. Now's your opportunity to explain in layman's terms what that means and why it's important.
Well, a rescission is an act of rescinding or clawing back funding that's been appropriated through the appropriations process. And this is a separate tool from reconciliation, because all reconciliation does is set overall targets for spending and some policies. What it can't do is go backward and start taking back funding that's already been appropriated. A rescissions package can do that. The president identifies budget savings to either zero out entire federal programs or cut them by 5% or 10% or whatever the case may be. And then they put that in a message to Congress saying the president believes in rescinding, clawing back the following funds. Congress, once it receives that presidential message, has 45 days to either approve of the reductions or just let them go away, in which case the funding stays intact and nothing happens. The recent rescissions package, with about $9.3 billion in savings, is the first one from this Trump administration, mostly affecting foreign aid and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
So the House will probably agree with something like that, because it's easy to get a majority, or it's easier, I would imagine, to get a majority. What are the rules with the Senate? Does it require 60 senators, or is it like reconciliation that just requires a majority?
No, they can do 51 votes there, and it will be a close vote in the House. Believe it or not, there are certain Republicans, one from Nebraska was already saying today, well, I don't know if I can vote to rescind money for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Go figure. I mean, that's taxpayer-funded broadcasting. I mean, you pay your own way.
Right, yeah.
Why should taxpayers fund this?
And those were started back in the old days when it was hard to get on TV. Now, yahoos like me can get on YouTube and the radio and podcasts very easily.
Yeah, me too.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to give you those 2 minutes to sort of recap everything that you're thinking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. How can we get those tax cuts extended and have the essential functions of government at the same time?
We can do both, but it is going to take more work. The One Big Beautiful Bill should be viewed as the beginning of this process. With One Big Beautiful Bill, we can prevent a huge tax increase. We can start to chip away at the wasteful spending that's been going on in government for decades and has only increased since the COVID epidemic. Mm-hmm. We need much, much more action, however. Chip Roy and others in the House of Representatives are insisting that we move forward with more rescissions like the one the president just proposed. They're going to do more in the appropriations process to restrain spending, but we've got to tackle entitlements. They are the crisis right on our doorstep. They are no longer decades away. They're a few years away. That's our next big task.
Okay, I was just thinking the media is always saying that you're not supposed to talk about cutting entitlements.
Well, whether we reform them, slow their growth, whatever the case may be, we do have to face them. They are what are going to devour the federal budget and future taxpayers' finances.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I hope to see you again soon.
Me also. Take care. This is Talk Law Radio with Todd Marquardt. Been talking with Pete Sepp from the National Taxpayers Union about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And this is important. This is a legal issue blind spot that people need to be paying attention to. So contact your representative, your senator, and the White House and tell them how you want them to vote.